Under the pale glow of a flickering street lamp, George Parker stumbled along the narrow alley behind his apartment building, his mind distracted by the day's exhausting work. He had always been a man who liked routine, the kind of person who felt comfort in the mundane. That evening, his steps were heavy, his head filled with 1,000 small annoyances, emails to answer, reports to file, a phone call to make to his mother. It was the kind of night where the quiet felt oppressive, the dark shadows of the alley swallowing every flicker of light. He wasn't usually the sort to wander down back streets, but something about this particular alley had always intrigued him. It wasn't much of a shortcut, yet George had found himself walking this path more often in the past few weeks. Maybe it was the sense of abandonment that had a strange pull on him, or perhaps it was the dissonant hum that seemed to radiate from the alley's deepest corner, a sound so faint it was almost imperceptible, but there nonetheless. Tonight, as he walked past the trash cans and old wooden crates, something new caught his attention. Near a pile of discarded furniture, half hidden beneath a threadbare blanket, was an old radio. It was a large, clunky model, far older than anything George had seen in years. It had a tarnished silver surface, and the dial, though yellowed and cracked with age, still seemed to gleam faintly under the streetlight. George hesitated for a moment, the cold evening air creeping beneath his coat. But then, a curiosity he couldn't explain pushed him forward. Kneeling down, he reached out and brushed his fingers over the dusty surface. The radio was strangely warm to the touch, as if it had been left on for hours. He carefully picked it up and turned the dial. Static filled the air at first, the low crackling sound filling the silence of the alley. George turned the knob again, half expecting to hear the familiar tunes of a local station. Instead, the static grew louder, more intense, and then, unbelievably, it began to form into voices. At first, the voices were disjointed, garbled, and barely recognizable, but slowly they came into focus. George felt an inexplicable chill wash over him as the words began to cut through the noise, distinct and clear, as if the radio were picking up something it shouldn't. "George Parker," the voice said, cold and precise. His heart skipped a beat. He pulled the radio closer, unsure if he had imagined it, but the voice repeated his name with a chilling clarity. "George Parker," it echoed, "at 3:17 a.m. you will receive an unexpected visitor. You will not see their face. It will be too late by the time you do." The hairs on the back of George's neck stood up. He stared at the radio, wondering if he was hearing things. His thumb hovered over the dial, but the voice continued, undeterred. "You will not be able to remember the visitor's name, but you will feel it, their presence, just before it happens." The radio crackled again, and the voice disappeared as suddenly as it had come. George blinked, his pulse racing. He glanced around the alley as if expecting someone to jump out at him from the shadows, but nothing moved. The air seemed unnaturally still. He looked back at the radio, and slowly, almost reluctantly, he turned the dial again. For a moment it was just static again, no voices, no sounds, just the hum of emptiness. Then, as if it had been waiting, the voice returned. "Don't be afraid," it whispered this time. "We are merely telling you the truth, George. The truth you already know, but don't want to face." With a quick jerk, George turned the radio off, pressing the button at the top of the device. Silence. His hands were shaking as he held it in his lap. His mind raced. Who or what was speaking to him? He had heard stories of old radios picking up strange transmissions, voices from beyond the grave, or signals from different time periods. But this felt different. He looked around again, trying to make sense of the eerie encounter, but there was no one else in sight. No one would have known he was here, in this forgotten corner of the city, least of all with a radio that spoke his name. He stood up quickly, feeling a sudden urgency to return home. The radio seemed to hum softly in his hand, almost as if it were alive, its warmth making his fingers tingle. That night, George couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him. He had barely gotten any sleep, his mind replaying the strange encounter over and over again. The radio, his new unsettling possession, sat on the table beside his bed, silent, unmoving. Every now and then he would glance over at it, half expecting it to come to life again. When he woke up the next morning, his thoughts were clouded with dread, as if he knew something was coming. He had a dull headache, but he couldn't remember the last time he had felt truly rested. At the back of his mind, there was an unease that refused to dissipate. It was then that the day started to unfold. Just as the radio had predicted, at 3:17 p.m., George received an unexpected visit. It was a man he had never seen before, standing on his doorstep with an unreadable expression. George froze for a moment, staring at him through the peephole, as though he knew the man's appearance before he even opened the door. The visitor's face was hidden by the brim of his hat, but George could see a shadow of something in his eyes, something that seemed almost familiar. The man didn't speak, and yet George felt a cold weight settle in his chest. It was the same sensation he'd felt when the radio had described the visitor's presence. He opened the door with a hesitant hand, but before he could utter a word, the man was gone. No trace, no sound, just a fleeting moment that left George feeling more unsettled than ever. Days passed, but the unease lingered, wrapping around him like a thick fog. And then, the radio began its broadcasts once more. At first it was little things, simple details, things that only George would have known. The voices spoke of his daily routine, each broadcast predicting an event before it happened, as if the radio were mapping out his life in real time. At work, the radio told him when he would receive an email, or when a particular colleague would stop by his office. It was a strange coincidence, or so he thought at first. But then, the predictions became darker. The radio began speaking of things that hadn't yet happened but would, and each broadcast left George feeling more and more paranoid. A letter would arrive, a phone call, a small, unsettling event that left him feeling like he was being watched. The worst part was the sense of inevitability. The more the radio spoke, the more he realized he could not change the course of events. The predictions became so accurate, so precise, that he began to wonder if there was any point in living his life anymore. Was he just a puppet, and was the radio the one pulling the strings? Then, the broadcasts took a darker turn. One night as he sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the voice on the radio became eerily calm. "Tonight, George," it said, "you will meet your end." The words sent a shock through his body. His pulse quickened, and his fingers froze on the dial. The radio continued. "The visitor you met is the one who will bring you to the end. You will never see it coming, for it has already begun." The static began to rise, the hum of the radio growing louder. George's breath caught in his throat, his mind racing for an explanation, anything to make sense of this. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the static stopped. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to stretch on forever. George's heart hammered in his chest. What did it mean? What had just happened? He slowly reached out, his hand trembling, and turned the radio off. The room felt colder now, as though the very air had been sucked out of it. He could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on him, suffocating him. And as he stood there, alone in his apartment, he finally realized the truth. The radio had been telling him what would happen before it happened, but it had never been clear about when. And now it had stopped. The predictions had ended, and in that silence, George understood. His death had come. That night, sleep was impossible. George lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the radio sitting on his bedside table, like a dormant creature waiting to stir. The message had been clear. The voice had spoken with certainty. He would meet his end. But when? How? His mind raced through every possibility, every scenario in which he might be able to avoid whatever fate had been set in motion. At some point, exhaustion took over, and he drifted into a restless sleep. His dreams were strange and distorted, filled with the static and half-heard whispers. When he awoke, the radio was on. He hadn't touched it. He was sure of that. The voice was speaking again, low and steady, as though it had never left. Today, George Parker will leave his apartment at precisely 8:42 a.m. He will stop at the corner store for coffee and a newspaper. He will notice a man watching him from across the street. George sat up, his pulse hammering. He looked at the clock. 8:30 a.m. The radio continued. The man will not follow him. Not yet. The static returned. George stared at the radio, feeling cold all over. He had to test it, see if the predictions were real or just some strange trick his mind was playing on him. At 8:42 a.m. he left his apartment, his movements slow, deliberate. He felt ridiculous at first, letting a broken radio dictate his morning, but the unease in his chest refused to fade. As he stepped outside, he found himself walking toward the corner store, just as the voice had said. Inside, he bought a cup of coffee and a newspaper. The routine felt normal, but his hands trembled slightly as he picked up the paper. He turned to leave, his breath coming a little faster now. And then, just as he stepped outside, he saw him. Across the street, a man stood beneath a lamppost, his posture unnervingly still. He wore a dark coat and a hat pulled low over his face. George couldn't make out his features, but he knew the man was watching him. A chill ran down his spine. He turned away quickly, pretending not to notice, but the weight of that gaze burned into him. He walked faster than usual, resisting the urge to look over his shoulder. The voice had said the man wouldn't follow him, not yet. But what did that mean? By the time George reached his apartment, his skin was clammy with the sweat. He locked the door behind him, breathing heavily, trying to convince himself it was all just coincidence. But deep down, he knew the radio was telling the truth. The predictions continued, small at first. Each morning, the voice would describe his day in detail, what he would eat, where he would go, who he would see. And every time the events unfolded exactly as described. No matter how hard he tried to change things, choosing a different route, skipping meals, ignoring plans, it didn't matter. The predictions would simply adjust, as though the voice already knew what he would do before he did. Days turned into weeks, and George became obsessed. He barely left his apartment unless the radio dictated it. He spent hours staring at it, listening to the static, waiting for the next transmission. Each prediction was a thread, weaving a net around him, tightening with each passing day. And then, one night, the voice changed. It was no longer the calm, detached voice that had narrated his life so far. This time, it was softer, almost amused. "You cannot escape, George," it whispered. "You were never meant to." He felt his stomach drop. That night he didn't sleep. He sat in front of the radio, waiting for another transmission, but none came. The silence was worse than the predictions. The next morning the voice returned, its tone eerily normal. "George Parker will receive a phone call at 10:23 a.m. He will not recognize the number." George's heart pounded. He checked the clock. 10:22. He stared at his phone, dread curling in his gut. Then, at exactly 10:23, it rang. The number was unknown. His hands shook as he picked it up. Silence. Then, a soft static, almost imperceptible. But there, the same static from the radio. George hung up immediately. His breath was coming in short gasps now. He turned to the radio, expecting it to say something, but it remained silent. He knew now that he was being watched, tracked. The radio wasn't just predicting his life, it was controlling it. That evening the voice returned. "George Parker will have an unexpected visitor at 11:45 p.m. His blood turned to ice. He sat in his chair, staring at the door, unable to move. The hours crawled by, and with each passing minute, his fear grew. He told himself it wouldn't happen. If he didn't open the door, nothing could happen, right? At 11:45, a knock echoed through the apartment. A slow, deliberate knock. George's breath hitched. He clutched the arms of his chair, heart hammering so hard it hurt. He didn't move, didn't breathe. Another knock. Then, silence. The air was thick with tension, the room colder than it had been before. And then, from the radio, "You should have answered, George." His stomach twisted. The static rose, growing louder, filling the room with a deafening hum. The radio flickered, its old dials shifting on their own. He tried to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge. "You were never meant to change your fate." Then, everything stopped. Silence. George sat frozen in his chair, every nerve in his body screaming at him to move, to run. But he couldn't. And then, the final words came. "The end is near, George." The room felt impossibly still. For the first time in weeks, the radio went completely dead. The silence stretched through the apartment, thick and suffocating. George sat rigid in his chair, staring at the radio, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the radio remained lifeless, its once familiar static gone. The absence of sound was worse than the messages. His body ached from exhaustion, but he couldn't move. The final words the radio had spoken repeated in his mind, over and over again. "The end is near, George." He didn't know what that meant, but the weight of inevitability pressed down on him. Something was coming. The apartment felt different now, as if the very air had changed. The shadows in the corners stretched just a little too far, their edges sharper, darker. The lights above flickered, casting strange patterns on the walls. A cold draft seeped through the apartment, though the windows were shut. Then, a noise, not from the radio, from the hallway outside his apartment. A slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. George's breath hitched, his body locking up as he turned his head toward the door. The sound grew closer. The hallway light outside flickered, casting long shadows under the crack of his door. A knock, soft at first, barely audible. Then another, harder this time. George didn't move. He didn't even breathe. The air around him thickened, pressing against his skin like unseen hands. He could feel something beyond that door, waiting, watching. Another knock. Then, impossibly, the doorknob turned. The lock should have held. It should have held. But he heard the soft click of it unlocking from the inside. His chest tightened with fear. He hadn't touched it. The door creaked open just an inch. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of something old and rotting. The hallway beyond was shrouded in darkness, deeper than it should have been. A void. George's heart pounded against his ribs. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his body refused to move. A whisper drifted through the crack in the door, curling into the room like smoke. A voice, barely audible. "It's time." The radio came back to life with a shriek of static. The dials spun wildly, the old machine rattling, as if something inside it was struggling to break free. A voice, distorted and layered, cut through the noise. "George Parker is no longer here." The door swung open. Darkness poured in, swallowing the room. The lights flickered violently, casting frantic shadows across the walls. And then, everything stopped. The radio went silent. The lights dimmed. The apartment was empty. The only sound was the gentle hum of static, whispering from the old radio, waiting for the next name to be spoken.